Welcome to your 20-minute podcast with David Brower, where we do our best to give you useful information in 20 minutes or less. Now, here's your host, 5-time Voice Arts Awards nominee, David Brower.
Thanks, Ellen. This is David Brower with your 20-minute podcast. Our special guest from Salt Lake City, Utah is April Young Bennett. She began studying the lives of suffragists to inform her own activism. She's campaigned for better state and federal laws addressing the wage gap, health care, education, and juvenile justice, and for gender equality within her modern-day patriarchal religious community. I hope I said that right. As an organizer of the Ordained Women movement, she's led hundreds of women and men in marches and demonstrations that attracted national attention. And April helps feminists of different faiths share ideas and collaborate toward common goals at the Religious Feminism podcast. April, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
You're very welcome. So tell me, how did April Young Bennett start this history dive? This is really interesting to me.
I didn't start out wanting to study history so much as I was an activist. I wanted to make the world a better place.
Nice.
And I was working hard on that. I was working with other very passionate people. We were brainstorming all the time. We were trying everything, trial and error. And as we were doing this, it occurred to me, maybe somebody else has tried this before, and maybe we don't need to recreate the wheel.
There you go.
That's when I began studying my history.
Outstanding. So when did this all start? When did the aha or the light bulb or the epiphany or however you wish to call that, when did that all begin?
One moment I can point to that really made me interested in history is there was a time when I was marching with about 500 other women to a male-only meeting where we were requesting entrance. We wanted women to be allowed to enter and participate in this male-only meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got there, they did not let us in. And that reminded me of something I knew about from history when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. They were told the same thing. This is a male-only meeting.
Mm-hmm.
You can't participate. But here's what we'll do. We'll let you sit in the balcony and listen from behind a curtain. So you can't participate, but you'll hear it.
Wow.
And so here I was having an experience quite recently that was very similar to experiences that other women had already had hundreds of years ago.
Oh my gosh. And we think I shouldn't say we. At some point, some people somewhere think they are so progressive that the world has changed so much. But yet, when you look at something like this that is so important, some things have never changed.
Some things haven't. I think when I first started becoming an activist, I thought that the internet had changed everything. Now we can talk to each other so quickly and so easily. Communication is so easy. We can spread our message in so many different ways that things that have happened so long ago in the past aren't really relevant anymore because we don't have the same problems with communication and with technology.
Oh yeah, we've outgrown all that stuff, right?
Well, that's what I thought at first.
Right.
But then I realized that we're still changing hearts and minds, and the skills it takes to do that haven't changed over time. The same interpersonal skills that you need to change hearts and mind and therefore change the world still apply.
Well said. Well said. And it is, I would think, I don't know if it's one heart and mind at a time or it's 500 hearts and minds at a time, but it's certainly often, I would think, moves slower than you would like it to.
It does. I think we like to think that we progress always onward. We're just getting better and better and better over time.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the way change happens is more often a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so we have to remember our past. We have to, because we're going to go back there whether we want to or not.
Yeah.
We're always kind of rotating a little bit back as we try to go forward.
Absolutely right. And it catches us off guard, don't you think, in this, as you mentioned, the way technology changes, the speed of everything, the need for immediate gratification. We're going 150 miles an hour. And I got to think that makes it harder to go 2 steps forward and 1 step back at some point.
In some ways it does. I think I love technology personally. I would never go backward that way.
Oh, for sure.
But yes, there are certain things that, now you can all of a sudden be yelled at over the internet from nowhere all the time. Sometimes
right.
you really have to control yourself and give yourself a break every now and then because it's not like before where you could just go hide from everyone and kind of take some deep breaths.
Absolutely.
You've got to be intentional about it now.
So the book that you have is Ask a Suffragist, Stories and Wisdom from America's First Feminists. Who's the lady on the cover?
That's Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She's one of my personal heroes. She was one of the early suffragists in the United States, and she started out as an abolitionist, trying to end slavery and eventually being successful in that. Her and many others that worked with her were successful in abolishing slavery in the United States. But she kind of became interested in women's rights, particularly as a part of this. As she became a famous abolitionist and became known for her speeches and her poetry and began earning money, she invested that money in her new family. She married someone who had children, so she now was a stepmother and a wife, and she invested in a farm for her new family. But shortly after that time, her husband passed away. And even though she had been the one who had bought the farm, she had been the one who had bought the house, everything went into her husband's name as soon as she married. And when he died, just shortly thereafter, everything she owned was taken away from her. And that's when she became passionate about women's rights as well.
Oh my gosh. And you don't know till you don't. I mean, you don't know what you don't know sometimes, but in that era, I would think, and I'm assuming here, that you really don't know that until you get into it and something happens, right?
Right. So once she had that experience, suddenly she was very motivated to make the world a better place for women. And she kind of had to push and fight her way into the women's rights community because back then, and unfortunately still today, there was lots of racist sentiment within that community.
You bet. You bet. And it's not just black and white anymore, is it?
It's not, no. And it never was, really. There are all sorts of differences that can divide us. They can also make us stronger because the more diverse we are, the more people we have bringing in unique perspectives and unique ideas that will only make our movement stronger.
Boy, isn't that the truth? Absolutely right. And man, I got goosebumps on that. What an amazing, amazing woman. Goodness gracious. And you hear about some of the well-known suffragists, right, like Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. But there's a lot behind the scenes that really help kind of carve the path, isn't there?
There are. One of the reasons I wrote my book is because I had read many, many, many biographies of famous and important women like the ones you mentioned. And while those were wonderful and I love them, when you're reading a biography about one single solitary hero, it almost makes it feel like the world was changed by this one person working alone. But as a real-time activist, I know that movements don't come from one single person. A movement is made up of many people working sometimes in harmony, sometimes completely separately. And I wanted a book that more accurately reflected that there were people of many different races, different backgrounds, some not famous at all, who worked to make this happen for us.
Good for you. Good for you. So when did you start the book? I guess it just came out this past June, right?
It did. It just came out this past June. I started my research years ago, but I didn't know I was researching to write a book. I was researching to be a better activist.
There you go.
So I started studying these wonderful women and men, because there were many men that were involved in the women's rights movement.
You bet.
I started studying their lives a long time ago because I was an activist and I wanted to be better at it, and I wanted to know my history and know what I could learn from the people who came before me. This book itself, in book form, I would say probably 3 or 4 years back, it started to take the form of a book.
And so where did you get your activism from? When did you wake up one morning and go, you know what, I'm tired of this, I'm going to go fix it?
I think I have always been an activist on weekdays, but I really became an activist in the most urgent sense of the word when I realized that I wanted to be an activist on Sunday too.
Oh, goodness.
And so I had been trained as a child to really be a critical thinker, really be a mover and shaker, to make things happen, and to apply that to all areas of my life except for at church. Church was the exception. It's okay to have patriarchy at church.
Oh my gosh. I was raised Mormon. That sounds very familiar to me.
Yes, I was raised Mormon.
Okay, there you go.
However, as I've worked with many other religions, I found that we're not the only ones.
No, for sure. No, that's absolutely right.
There are many religions.
Well, hats off to your parents, first and foremost, right? To create that kind of environment to at least
Yeah.
6 days a week.
I always felt
Right?
supported in my goals.
Wow.
Except for on Sunday, where it'd be like, it's okay that only the boys are allowed to do these things. That's all right.
Yeah, I hear you.
So when I became an adult and I had my own daughter, I realized that it was important to me to change, this part of my life that was, frankly, even a little bit more behind than the rest of the world.
Sure.
And that's when I really started becoming involved in Mormon feminist activism. And as I became involved in that, I also became involved in other causes in my community, working towards having better health care for everyone, working towards educational goals, juvenile justice goals. And then I started working with other women who were activists within their faith communities. And that's when I started to find that there were so many ways that our struggles are the same. And we may have different theologies,
Right.
but our struggles to gain equality within our faith communities are pretty universal. And there's a lot we can learn from each other.
That makes a lot of sense. It really does, because, on one hand, there's whoever knows how many religions, but on the other hand, there's so many similarities, right? And there's so many different paths to look at your religion and your faith, and Buddha or whoever, and to be able to have a community to where you can move each other along because of your combined interest in creating a better world. That's got to be fascinating.
Yeah, and one thing I like to point out when I tell people about my work with religious communities, a lot of times they'll say, well, why don't you just get out of religious communities? And this is true today with the people that I've worked with today. And it was true in history that many activists, many feminist activists, became activists for two different reasons. They were motivated by their religion. One is that, like I said, it can be pretty frustrating experiencing so much patriarchy.
Yeah.
So women are frustrated by their patriarchy that they experience within their theological faith communities, and that motivates them to change those and to become activists. But another thing is, it doesn't just frustrate them. Their religions and their faiths actually inspire them and give them the values of social justice, the values of self-sacrifice, about caring about other people, about wanting to make the world a better place. These values actually are born out of their faith.
Man, that makes all the sense in the world. If you are inspired to be an activist and you begin that in your religious world, for lack of a better term, and all of a sudden you see, I'm going 3 steps forward now instead of 1 step back, and you start feeling inspired and energized and engaged, and all of a sudden that has to bleed over into other parts of your world, doesn't it?
It does. One person that we talk a lot about from the suffrage movement is Sojourner Truth. And many people know that Sojourner Truth was a women's rights activist. But what they don't know is originally she was a preacher.
Really?
That's how she began in this work. That's how she originally found her voice, is she was a preacher. She was an independent preacher and was teaching the gospel in the way that she interpreted it. And she interpreted it in a way that was empowering and egalitarian. And that's what led her to try to make the rest of the world more empowered and egalitarian.
Oh, my gosh. And the other thing that's interesting to me is, in her experience, and some of these other suffragists and yourself, I would think, is when you are touched by different circumstances that frustrate you, that bother you, that anger you, that challenge you, those are the kinds of things that motivate you to say, hey, we got to fix this.
Absolutely. Apathy grows when you're just fine.
Right. Yeah, well said.
If you're not fine, then you can't be apathetic. You have to go out and do something and make a change. And another thing I like to tell people about activists that many people don't know is many people assume that activists are just a bunch of angry people. And it's true. We do have lots of righteous indignation. But I have found that activists are some of the most optimistic people on earth. These are people who actually believe it's possible to make the world a better place.
Wow.
They believe it so firmly that they're willing to go out and try to do it. You don't meet people. You meet a lot of jaded people in the world, people who wouldn't even bother to try to change the world.
Right.
Those people aren't activists.
For sure. And the other thing with activists, I think, as with other groups, I don't mean to generalize, but I guess I am, is that when you have that core of really passionate, engaged people are so strong in their beliefs and their activist causes. And then you have those one or two or three that capture the headlines.
Yes, which is why sometimes we get the idea that, oh, it was this one person who caused all this change to happen, and we don't see all the many other people contributing.
Well said.
Which is one of the reasons why I started researching my history, because I knew that those solitary heroes couldn't have possibly done this alone, and I wanted to know more about the other people who were there.
Well, yeah, and the other part of that I would think, which would really be interesting from a historical standpoint, is because, you know, they didn't have the internet or hardly newspapers or radio or TV or anything like that. Everything was kind of handed down by stories or written word or what have you. And so to kind of find a way to dip into those long-lost stories has got to be just crazy fun.
It is fun, and you really get to feel like you know these people and you have new allies on your journey.
Wow.
People who have been through it before that you're learning from.
Wow. So tell me about your Religious Feminism podcast.
Like my book, Ask a Suffragist, the Religious Feminism podcast was born out of my desire to become a better activist myself. And I was working with some of the best Mormon feminists in the world, people who could teach me so much. But I also started to wonder, what could we learn from other people who are in a similar journey, but not within our faith community?
Sure.
And the Religious Feminism podcast gave me an opportunity to meet people in other faith communities who were engaged in a similar struggle and to get ideas from people who were doing things in different communities in different ways.
Wow. How cool is that? And how long have you been doing that?
It's been about 2 years.
Nice. Good for you. Good for you. And I assume, like all great podcasts in the world, that's a selfish, gratuitous plug, that you can get your podcast pretty much anywhere, right? iTunes, all
That's
those places.
Right.
So you just do
That's right.
You just do a search for either your name or a Religious Feminism podcast?
Yep. April Young Bennett or Religious Feminism podcast. It'll come up.
Nice. And your book, like I say, it's just been out since June. You have a Kindle format and a hard book available on Amazon. Can people get your books in other areas as well?
Absolutely. If you visit askasuffragist.com, I have links to where you can find that in your local bookstore or in other big bookstores and, of course, at Amazon.
Well, of course. That's awesome. Askasuffragist.com. That's the website. That's how people can learn more about you, connect to your podcast, buy your books. And so do you have another book in the works?
I do. I am working on another Ask a Suffragist book called Activists Who Built a Movement. So in my first book, I talk about America's first feminists. That's what it's titled.
Yep.
And I talk about the people who came up with this bold new idea when nobody was thinking of this.
Wow.
In the next book, I talk about where they actually mobilized together and they became activists and they started working in an organized way to change the world.
Man, you know what? It's interesting to me that every time you speak, there's so much joy and so much passion about what you do, not to mention the authenticity and integrity that you bring to your projects, but you love doing this.
Absolutely.
So cool.
Changing the world is fun.
So cool. One small step at a time. That is so cool. Congratulations. Continued success. April Young Bennett. The website is askasuffragist.com. Her books are available on Amazon as well as the website. You can reach out to her to learn more. And also be sure to check out her podcast wherever podcasts can be found, Religious Feminism Podcast. And April Young Bennett from Salt Lake City, again, congratulations, and thanks for being on the show. It was great fun.
Thank you.
Listen to your 20-minute podcast with David Brower on the go. Downloads are available on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, any podcast app, and on our website at davidbrowervo.com/your20minute podcast. Until next time, thank you for listening.